Welcome in, everyone. Today is a pretty exciting video. We are taking part in the City Skylines Global Collaboration, and we built a Bayside Marina and community on a little bit of a slope here, tucked away in this sort of cove off of the ocean, but connected to a lot of the infrastructure that Palm, Skibbeth, and Toady have started working around. And I think what's really cool is I feel like this is the start of what could be the downtown, the sort of epicenter of the city as it continues to grow with other creators collaborating on this build. After reviewing the map that Sanctum Gamer made and seeing where Toady and Skibbeth built, I thought placing something in between there would help show where the city could be built. So I started with this idea of putting a marina here in this cove because it would be protected from the ocean waves. And based on the terrain, I knew I was going to have to terrace it, and I wanted to create an area of mixed-use buildings along with a lot of green space sort of tucked inside. But we'll talk more about that in just a minute. If you are new here, be sure to hit the subscribe button, leave a like, comment down below with your thoughts. If you haven't checked us out at twitch.tv/Slate3K, you should. We play a variety of games and spend a lot of time with the community. Now, let's get to today's build. This video is going to be a little bit different from some of my other videos in that we're going to focus a lot on time-lapsing because this build took me several hours. And really, it was just sort of cumbersome because of the terrain. Given the height change from sea level to the ground level that most of the map is on, and being on a hill, I wanted to try to fix this in a way that looked like it was purposeful. So I wanted the bay edge to really be focused on just the views. I wanted that to be more of almost like an ongoing park than anything else. And as you progress upward to the higher terrain levels that sort of make the ground level for what most of the map seems to be on, that area would be more dense and potentially the start of a city. So I'm hoping that someone else will take that and extend it into more of a downtown. But for now, we're focused on at least getting there to the road that sort of encompasses the area. I wanted to use that as a marker for where my build should take place within, all the way down to the water. So as you've noticed, I've done a couple of things. We've removed the trees and we've started terraforming into terraces. This is meant to help me try to figure out how many terraces and how this is all going to take shape. Initially, I was hoping just to do a seawall on the coastline and then one terrace, but it just looked too imposing and large compared to the buildings that I was going to be placing around it. So therefore, we have 3 walls in total by the finished product. And the only thing that really changes is the complications from doing some of the networks and pathing and stuff like that with roads to getting them to each tier and making it all look sort of smooth and clean. You will see me make a couple of decisions where I might go back and forth a little bit with angles and stuff like that because I was trying to find what felt most natural. What I knew I wanted to do is I wanted to create a pedestrian pathway that would be sort of connected to the seawall, allowing me some green space to put in parks so there would be like a little bit of separation there, but plenty of pathing to connect the two. Kind of doubling up on the pedestrian pathing that might be near the water. After some consideration, I wanted this area to feel a little bit tropical. I recently spent some time in California, so I thought it'd be cool to have California palms, give it a few palm trees, but then a mix of trees sort of in the background that blended in better with the map and what was already established. Also wanted to ensure that all the lines sort of went along with the coastal line and the seawall that I was creating. This became a little bit complicated in some areas, so I did what I could to try to match that, and it took a little bit of finesse at the end. But overall, I think it came out pretty good. Now, you all might not see every single tweak I made to it with Move It or just the finesse work, but trust me, it was there. It took place repeatedly, but we got there. Now, like I said before, I wanted to create little pedestrian paths that would link up the seawall to the main pedestrian road, and the space between them were just going to be green space. It was going to be parks that you could just hang out, walk around, and enjoy the day. Now, before the Promenades and Plazas DLC, I would have to make a road here somewhere to incorporate buildings very closely to the waterline. Thankfully, with the DLC, I don't have to do that, and we can rely strictly on the pedestrian roads. And for some reason, I feel like this condenses the space a little bit, and it gives you opportunity to put things really tightly together, especially along something like a coastline. Now, to make some of these buildings a little bit bigger and to fill the space the way I want, I decided to combine them. I'm starting off with the apartments that are a little bit more of the centerpiece to the front waterline, and then we'll eventually get to the marina, which is going to be a little bit off to the side. Then I'm going to continue to use pathing just to connect a few things and still make it a very walkable space. And what I thought to make it even seem maybe a little bit more realistic was to add in some options for roads to run behind some of the buildings, giving us access to parking and maybe sort of a service road system that would run just in between some of the terraces. Now, if you haven't heard about these brushes I'm using currently, I would highly recommend them. I've talked about them in a few videos, especially like detailing tips and tricks, I think, where these brushes help solve a lot of issues you might have along the way with where surface painter edges are, or just trying to clean up things to make them look a little bit more polished. Would highly recommend checking these out, especially if you're getting into detail work. Now, as you can see, I've doubled up on the buildings a little bit and made them look more dense. I feel like they take up the space better and it looks more appealing just in my eyes, especially when the completed project was done. It just fit better, even though it's just the same buildings duplicated. Now it's time to start working on where the marina is going to go, kind of what I thought was initially going to be the centerpiece, but what became just kind of an addition to this that sort of became the piece at the end that sort of wrapped everything up. It operated in such a way because it needs to be low to the water, and then it felt like that terrain level was going to be the lower terrain level for all of our pathing and stuff like that that was close to the coastline. So it sort of works out. It's kind of the end piece to our whole build here. So a couple things we need to do is add some sort of lanes for, so what I knew I needed to do is add a network for vehicles to come down in here, access the service point, but this road was eventually also going to have to go up a tier somewhere. There's some complicated road work we have to do at some point. It's complicated in the sense that I have to keep it sort of confined to a small work area. I also knew that this was a good way to end the pedestrian walkway, though I didn't really like how it blended together, so I ended up upgrading the road just to a normal 2-lane road. Then with Node Controller, which is one of the best tools you can use, we can modify that slightly and make it look a little bit cleaner and a little more justified in terms of how it comes together. Now, to conquer the elevation and allow for traffic flow, I knew I wanted to do a windy road that you might see out west somewhere up the hill. This took a little bit of work, but eventually we got there. I wanted it to wrap around and then elevate and connect to the side of the city where Toadie's build is. Overall, I think the placement of what I'm trying to establish here is pretty great because it's going to tie together both sides of the city that's established thus far. Now, I know I needed to create these walls, terraces, to kind of break up the height change from the lower portion near the bay up to the road. This is going to take me a minute, and you can see as I'm looking at it, I realized that this is a really tall wall, which is why, again, I broke it up into multiple tiers. I just didn't want this to be super imposing right behind the buildings. It was taller than the buildings, and it just felt way too large. And then from the water, looking at it, it's just going to look like a massive wall that lacks any sort of depth. And I was worried that aesthetically, it just would be really imposing and not as interesting. Not to mention kind of unrealistic in that sense. Now, after some fiddling around, I finally got the wall in place and got the curvature down on one end. So now I want to make sure I add some sort of access up to this higher tier from the marina side. I realized I didn't really set up this road initially to accommodate that, so I was going to have to play around and figure out how to make that work. I tried a few options from starting near the marina and working up the hill, and I was having some issues aligning it the way I wanted, so then I did the flip side where I started up top and I brought the road down to create a little bit smoother transition along with the wall. It took some time, but eventually you'll see that we're able to make this work a little bit more appropriately. But then I started to think about the other side and how that was all going to connect. I thought on this side, given the terrain, especially from that one road that was already pre-established and down to the lower bay area, that this road should just be something that drives traffic from the lower tiers to the upper tier. This road was not designed to bend into the design as much as it was to just accommodate a specific purpose to let traffic flow in or out of our build area. In retrospect, I don't think this road was anything that inventive. It kind of came across really flat in the end, which you guys will see later. Not my favorite part of this, but functionality wise, I think it works for what I'm trying to establish. It just, I don't know, felt a little bit lackluster in the end. Now, in terms of working up the tiers, I wanted this to have like those short ramps between the intersections themselves that connected each tier together. Normally, I'll work on a little bit more of the network aspect of it, developing the transportation lanes and everything like that before I start placing too many buildings, but it is helpful to understand size and scale of certain areas by placing like your kind of key mark building or whatever you want to be the starting foundation of what you're going to build around an area. So for example, I wanted to use this King Lino asset where it's sort of an outdoor mall on one of the tiers. Or initially this was going to go closer to the water, but then I decided to move it back. This was an interesting decision given that it's like the shortest building or one of the shorter buildings that I'm using in the entire build. I knew that elevating it a tier would keep it from being too hidden, whereas in the lower space, I'm using kind of taller buildings to cover up some of the wall. Again, more aesthetic choices than anything else. Utilizing paths and some brush assets, I'm able to create more of these sort of green park areas that are next to the buildings and connecting some of the buildings. And then I'm going to work on service roads that run behind and act as, again, service roads for some of these buildings. Additionally, we can add in parking to some of these areas just to accommodate some vehicular traffic. Now, if this was just my build where it wasn't something that was going to be passed around, I probably would have pulled more assets. Like I think it'd be cool to have some restaurants in here, maybe more small shops. Another little shopping area built into it could have been cool. But towards the end, we still need to figure out how to get this road down to the lower roads. That way cars can travel in behind the marina and work their way up this network system. Some of this goes back to the trip I took to California, where a lot of these roads will be running along the coastline, but then there's smaller roads or they split off to go up or down hills. Now in those areas too, though, a lot of the buildings and stuff like that accommodate for some of the height. So you don't have maybe massive retaining walls like I'm using now, but I tend to think that using walls like this can help the look of your city when you're building. It kind of smooths some of those details out, because obviously building on terrain that is uneven can often create like weird foundations and stuff like that on buildings, and I didn't really want that here. Now obviously putting networks together too closely can cause some terraforming issues, so I wanted to use the retaining wall to help cover up some of those height changes, so cover up the cliff effect that you have in game, and then using networks that create terrain changes can help consolidate the space that the cliff takes up, therefore you're able to fit it underneath something like a retaining wall. Now with this edge where I'm curving it alongside the road and lowering the overall height of the wall with the road, I had some issues with nodes. There was like a spot where the retaining wall almost seemed to just want to vertically lift above the road. So this took a little bit of time to smooth out, and I got it as close as I could. Aesthetically, it looks fine, but if you look really, really closely, you can see that sometimes there's like separation between the road height and the retaining wall height. No matter almost what you do, it's just going to be there. Surface painter and brushes, you can sometimes fill in some of the gaps and make it look appropriate. I'm going to use the brush tool that I mentioned earlier in order to make the sidewalk look like it just combines with the road, and then also extend it down. So again, you still have some imperfections here, which takes some tweaks, but we're getting really close. Finishing it up with a few more of these network terraforming tools just to, again, consolidate the area that the cliff takes up. I don't want grass raising up so much near the wall, at least for this build. I want it all to seem pretty smooth, and then the wall is really where the height change happens. This often allows me to build closer to walls, smoothing out that terrain. So if I did have like a kind of a more squared off area in that corner, I could put a building there or something like that. Maybe it just could be a park of some sort and just add some vegetation, but we'll see when we get there in just a little bit. Now, something I do want to make sure I add in a few spots is just some form of parking. Now, once we get some of this water out of the way, you'll see that the parking kind of fills in this space that we have available. I was tempted to add more buildings here, but it was starting to look a little bit cluttered, and plus the curvature of the roads was kind of limiting the space in a way. I was bouncing around on this build a bunch, just finding certain areas that I was focused on, and then I would jump to something else once I was in the process of trying to figure out what I wanted to do in a different area. I struggled a little bit with deciding what buildings to use and how to place them, so I was kind of bouncing around as ideas came to me, and then things just eventually started to work out. It took a little bit of time to figure out a few things, especially, you know, the terrain changes obviously, and how I wanted to do the retaining walls. Again, it was like a slightly different concept than I had initially in my head. Fixing the marina and adding this wall beneath it tends to clean up the edge of the marina, because you don't really want to see the cliff underneath the docks. I just think that looks a little bit unrealistic. So I tend to try to put some sort of wall under this asset. I like this asset for the bay though. I think it actually works really, really well to have some sort of like little yacht club or boating club. It also gives a little bit of an end cap to the rest of our build that is more focused on density towards the middle. Behind it, I think I'm going to add houses eventually, but it took me a minute to decide. I was tempted to add more apartments, but then I thought the area was starting to get a little bit overwhelming with just residential. So I kind of wanted to lower the residential density down into maybe housing on that end. The road pathing at the top tier took me a little while to decide on. I wasn't sure how I wanted to go about it. Part of me wanted to do something a little bit more gridded up here to look like the start of like a downtown area, but I wasn't entirely sure how much space I needed on that middle tier. So I was kind of bouncing back and forth to see how much space I needed to like utilize to place some buildings to make it look obviously realistic. But the building selection was also a little bit time consuming. I kind of bounced around between residential and how much commercial to do. I didn't want to add a ton of assets to our current build. Now, I don't know if this building combination I'm going to do is as effective as some of the other ones I did. You'll notice that over the course of the video, I did several combos of buildings, and I think that's a great way to add a style to your city in a specific area without it departing every time you place down a new building. It's something to consider, at least. I attempted to do the same sort of wall for the second terrace here, but I decided to go against that and do something slightly different. Part of that was to create some diversity aesthetically. This would create some sort of progression or difference between the tiers. Always try to mix up some of your style, some of the things you're using. Some of it will just show that maybe the city's been there a little bit longer than just now, right? Like, it gives it some identity. Maybe you can develop a purpose around that identity. And I totally get that. I just said to try duplicating buildings as a way of consistency, but I think there's a balance there. I think finding different pieces in different spots can help like just diversify what you're offering. I think if your city is primarily brick, having multiple brick buildings and having to duplicate those buildings is rather common, but then you can have that one glass building or some sort of feature to show maybe something a little bit more modern or a new part of town. Now I'm looking at the second tier here and I'm realizing how big this wall really feels. It's pretty significant in terms of vertical scale and just how monumental it seems. And my fear is that it's going to look rather unrealistic. So I don't want to extend it too far, and I'm trying to find where that balance is. Ultimately, I also want to ensure that the ends of this key tend to fit against something to end it, because I've noticed that sometimes keys that just end abruptly can look a little bit funky. Like there's just this height or this elevation there that ends, and I mean, if people were walking on it, they would just fall off, right? So I'm always trying to find ways of tucking the end of a wall or something like that into something else, like another network or a building. And for example, I'm going to try something a little bit later where I use rocks and nature to try to cover up the edge. Little things like that are kind of the things to me that separate a more polished look versus something that looks a little bit unfinished. It's also really funny to me how while I'm building this whole thing, I kind of kept adapting ideas. So I know that I started out the map a couple times before actually recording, where I was just playing with a couple of objects and trying to figure out how many tiers I need to make and stuff like that. And the idea kept evolving. So I would just say, don't always expect the idea to be perfect at the forefront. Sometimes you're going to have to adapt or change things as you progress. Like a lot of my network pathing and roads and stuff like that changed several times. And I was trying to find what fit everything else the best. So it was sort of a puzzle situation for me. As I continue to adjust ideas and things like that, it just feels natural sometimes just to say, oh, nope, that road doesn't work. Let's switch it to this. I'm, looking at this, for example, and I'm like, maybe the road should follow the key now instead of the key trying to follow the road. The curvature and stuff like that felt weird. So I think I ended up going something more familiar with like what the key was doing with the terrain. So the road is really following the terrain change, right? So then it seems more purposeful, which I think makes it blend in a little bit better. Ultimately, I just don't want things to stand out in a negative way or catch like attention that just shouldn't be catching attention. Like a lot of what I want people to see when they look at this area is the green space, the walkability to some degree, and a neat profile of just buildings. I think just a lot of these networks is kind of what really took me some of the most time, partially doing the walls and terraces, but also the roads. Given how confined I'm trying to build this space, in terms of just keeping it really dense and compact, it just created a little bit of technical issues in terms of how I wanted to make things blend together, especially on height changes and connecting this area to areas outside of the space that I'm working. Plus, I feel like I re-terraformed this about 14,000 times. It was constantly in flux. I couldn't quite decide on what height I needed everything at. I did fades that I would going to try to address later, and then I would go back and I would make it more of a cliff that I would address later. I was bouncing around a lot. Now with some building placement, I did want buildings to almost butt up with this terrace, partially to really expose the buildings to viewpoints from, if you're looking at the space, you can see just how the height changes and how the buildings kind of stack in a way. I thought this was a really interesting thing about California when I was visiting. It goes from the coastline up, and as you're looking back at the height changes, it's just almost like the buildings are just stacked on top of one another. There's depth there, so you know that they're not, but just the way it's so compact with space is just really interesting to me. So I wanted to sort of mimic that in my own way. Something that I try to keep in mind when placing buildings too is how the height is going to work with visibility. I want to basically create a skyline, and I want to utilize certain buildings to create sort of the tent pole for where, the peak is going to be. And then I like to work on that fade. That's probably one of my favorite things about city skylines is developing a skyline fade. So where it is the peak and where it is the highest to lower points around it. And then making sure visibility is really good for all the elements that sort of make the whole thing come together. I've played with the idea of making a video on this to break it down, and it is such a hard thing for me to somehow describe. That, and also the start of my cities, like how I plan the build and how I set it up. There's so much density in terms of some of the decision making I make. Plus, it's just more about what you want to do or what appeals to you too. So I don't know how helpful it really is for everybody, as much as maybe it just gives someone here and there an idea of how they should start. I don't know. It's something I still need to finish and work on because I've talked about it so often about doing a video on that. I just have to figure out what the best format is. But again, just like planning a skyline to me is one of those early things that I do in a city build because it tends to define the density of the city around it, right? Like how big the city really is going to be can quickly be figured out by how big your skyline is. And that's just assuming there is a skyline in terms of buildings and things. Something else I thought might be cool for this area was to do something like a outdoor amphitheater, but I didn't end up having the sort of space I wanted for that to be placed. So it didn't end up making it in. But for the next segment that I'm going to do here, it's a lot of building placement. So I'm going to zoom through some of this a little bit quicker so that you guys can see how this whole area came to life. And also I'm going to give you a break from hearing my voice for just a few minutes. But overall, it's a lot of just placement and trying to figure out where buildings belong and what buildings belong where, and to develop the start of a skyline that can be raised or headed in a direction where it could get higher if we so choose. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the building selection ideas that I had and stuff like that after a little bit of this time lapse when you can see everything sort of placed. now that we have a lot of the buildings placed, I want to talk a little bit about, I guess, my thought process during that segment of the video. I wanted to make sure that buildings were visible, and I also wanted to start to create some denser sort of downtown vibes with the building selection. How I did that was trying to find ways of filling up a lot of space with, you know, thicker buildings. I didn't want it to be a situation where it was like really small buildings either, like these tiny townhomes or something like that. I wanted more apartment complex style buildings that had, you know, maybe 4 to 5 stories. Also with the idea that some of the buildings might even be mixed use in a way. In addition to the residential and commercial focus, there's also some buildings that could be offices, and there's even a hotel being the tallest building in the setup, which I think is a Ritz-Carlton asset. So everything is shifting away from the less dense Bay Area, you know, close to the water, and it's going into something that is higher value potentially, and then moving towards something like a downtown. I try to find ways of creating sort of your peaks and then working down close to the water. I wanted it to kind of fall, but I didn't want it to be too generic. So I found that kind of curved building that's sitting on the second tier, and I thought that was a good corner piece there to kind of show some variety in terms of building height. But I like the idea that whichever way you're facing on these streets, buildings are kind of facing every road around that block. So I think that works out pretty well, and it makes the area appear dense. And then having layers of buildings that kind of, you know, from the water, it looks like they're almost stacked. You can tell they're not because there is depth there. It starts to look full, and again, more like a skyline, at least the start of one. Because then progressing further, it's like you may get more into offices, commercial stuff like that, that can venture in terms of height. Like I'm establishing the edge, right? So everything behind it could be taller, and then you have a nice fade from ground level, sea level up into the city. And I think that's always just a nice look. I think creating the tiers and the way I've set this up also creates an interesting thing because I'm trying to balance, you know, the height with the tiers too. So I do need some buildings that are a little abnormally high maybe for the area, like the curved like hotel building, and then the Ritz-Carlton in the background that's really tall. And then in front of that, like on the lower tiers, you kind of balance smaller buildings to make those buildings look, you know, even more elevated. It's a fun little game to play visually, and I think aesthetically it can be kind of pleasing as you start to like develop that skyline and work it into something that's just nice looking. I think building placement for me, I just kind of follow certain ideas of like, okay, I want to go from ground level up, right? All my downtowns tend to have or either a geographic reason for them ending, like, and not fading down to, let's say, a residential, you know, low residential house. It's either geographic in terms of like water or a cliff or something like that, or a terrace, or it has to fade. That's kind of like some sort of rule I have, I guess, for how I develop some of these areas. So you can see there's a combination of this where it fades down to a geographic change, being the Bay Area. And on the other side, I would imagine someone could continue to build the downtown if they so choose. So I think this was like a cool project to try to fit a bunch of buildings in a tight little spot like this, especially with the elevation change. From the detailing perspective, you know, a lot of what I have done at this point is just trying to figure out how to clean up edges and just throw some diversity in there. I didn't want everything to be some massive quay or seawall or something like that. So I ended up using some rocks around one of the curves, and that makes sort of a natural barrier, which is really nice. I was also fighting some of the terrain changes in the area just to create some more space for a couple smaller residential houses that are somewhat connected to the marina. I also thought a few houses here would help this sort of transition into Toadie's area a little bit better and a little bit more smoothly, not to have some massive building right outside of the area that she's established, given the height and building levels that she's using just on the edge there closer to where I'm constructing stuff. I think little ideas like that are important, especially on a collaboration build, to ensure that like nothing really looks super out of place. So trying to keep that in mind and trying to blend it in with, you know, the areas around what I'm doing. Additionally, you know, I'm looking at these cliffs, especially in this area, and I'm almost trying to cover them up so it just looks like little slopes and you don't see as much of a cliff. So I'm using a pretty high density amount of trees to cover up some of that, and then I'm smoothing it out as well. It's a fickle balance to make that happen, but it's certainly achievable. And much like detailing and then building placement, a lot of my camera movement and my eye movement and stuff like that is around, you know, going back, looking at it, seeing if it works, seeing if it doesn't work. It's all sort of an aesthetic thing to me at this point, and just trying to make something that doesn't look like anything stands out in a negative light. So I think if you're looking at this video, this is like one of the first videos you see from me, you'll notice how much I kind of zoom out, and I've cut some of it out because It's very much me looking at things and trying to find things that just don't align with what I'm trying to set up. More importantly, if you're someone that's new to the game or you're just diving into detail work and more advanced building, it's pretty common to want to go back and look at it, you know, compare it to something that you know in real life or images of something that you have, and just try to find a balance for you in terms of what things should look like and, you know, how much you're willing to surrender in terms of things being a little bit unrealistic versus realistic, or finding ways to cover them up. And I think that's one way detailing can often help people, is covering up some of the things that you just don't want to be the focal point. And oftentimes seeing that evolution of something at its sort of its basic level and then slowly developing it. I mean, you need to have those, you know, eyes from a further perspective, looking at it and taking it all in as a whole and in pieces, like it's a balancing game. But I think that also develops you as a builder and allows you to kind of see things in a much wider perspective. Because sometimes if I get too focused on something really small, I lose track of like how it connects to everything else. But ultimately being able to see it, it's also like a really rewarding experience when you zoom out and you're able to see the progression of the system, the evolution of the area, you know, whatever you have going on. It's a lot of fun to me. And that's one of the reasons I think this game is often very impressive, is because it's all coming from my mind. It's not, I don't do one-to-one, so it's all based off some things I know of reality, and I try to make it look realistic within reason, but it's an interesting thing to see how things develop. I mean, I started this area thinking I was going to just do a marina in this bay with some housing or something behind it, maybe some buildings, and turned into really the focal point being what I see as, you know, sort of the start of like a downtown area or some kind of high value space here where there's commercial and plenty of walking space. So I think it came out as a cool feature, especially tucked in here. Now, from a detailing perspective, I didn't do anything too crazy. It's a lot of shrubbery, bushes, trees, things like that fill in some of the gaps, clean up some edges, especially around pathing, and then create a little bit of change in terms of elevation in spots by including a tree here and there where it's a little bit flat. It's just trying to create some diversity, in colors and density in certain spots, and again, height. And I think those are some key principles. Like if you're trying to figure out how to detail and you're trying to learn some ideas about what you can do to advance your gameplay and then add some nice visuals, I think just finding little places to put things, whether it's a planter built into a building that isn't already set up, or just, you know, doing some little odds and ends, even if it's placing a few trees in these flatter areas, you can add something very valuable there. And I think the key is that you don't have to get too elaborate. And there's a lot of assets in the workshop, for instance, planners and things that you can use, even network planners that I end up using later, that can be very, very helpful to create something that looks very polished and clean without relying on a ton of assets to create. My focus is often very much looking for an area that just looks empty and trying to find small ways of filling that area, or just enough to make it not look as flat. You know, just even a tree casting a shadow can be helpful for some spots. One thing I ended up deciding to do was adding some thicker vegetation, especially in some of these smaller slopes near the seawalls and stuff. I thought it was just kind of a cool look to have some, you know, shrubbery, low shrubbery and some trees and stuff, make it almost appear natural, as if they've maybe set it up for, you know, to prevent any sort of erosion of the terrain. Then that area kind of stands out in its own way, because the areas that are now very polished and maybe a little bit simpler, especially where pedestrians are going to be walking, start to stand out on their own. You know, creating diversity in terms of what I'm setting up in some of the corners or little pockets, I think is just an interesting concept. And I think it worked well here, just to give it, again, some of its own flavor. Finally, again, I can't stress enough that using brushes to fill in some areas of concrete where you just have an assumption that people are going to be walking, you know, especially like near things like parking lots or near paths that just don't line up quite right on the edge of buildings. Filling that in with concrete, maybe placing planters or benches there, can be a really great little help to just, again, adding levels and levels of detail. And of course, cleaning up your build. And I just want to be clear, especially if you're new and you're looking at this and you're like, well, I couldn't do all this. I assure you that it's like not as complex as some people make it out to be. Because in reality, I mean, I probably exited the game 10 times because I needed to go get a different shrub, or I need to go look at a possible asset to fit somewhere. And it doesn't all come super easily. It's just a matter of placing things, looking at it and seeing, okay, does that work? And then a lot of times what I'll do is I'll set a precedent. So if I'm going to do something in one area, I might find in one or two other areas to do it in, right? I don't want to go too repetitive, but once you stylize the specific area with things like trees or shrubs, I think it's pretty common to reuse those elements kind of repeatedly. So there's certain trees that are already on the map, so I'm going to reuse those in certain areas to create maybe an area that appears a little bit more wild, or I'm going to, like, let's say, limit the amount of times I use it to make an area that might appear more manicured and kept up. So you can play with things that are already on the map and just duplicate, and sometimes it's simple as just adjusting the type of placement you're using, right? So on some of these tiers, I'm placing bushes in the corners, or some areas I might do trees in the corners and things. And that's a very simple method for detailing these areas, but it tends to work out, and it's just enough diversity from a build, especially that's not too far into using assets a whole lot, but it still makes it stand out and makes it look like it's really heavily detailed just by having a few precisely placed trees and things like that. And then again, I think consistency matters. I don't want to go in here and just place 10 palm trees and not have any palm trees anywhere else unless it's just like a really dedicated space. So I wanted to also blend it in with trees that are natural along the map in different areas to make sure that it didn't stand out as just a completely different world as opposed to some of the areas around it. And remember, you don't have to make it harder on yourself. If you can use the pedestrian roads and pedestrian paths and put trees to them, like that's an easy way to detail. That's something I sometimes forget about, is being able to now select like what kind of trees I want in certain areas just in the base game. So I think it's important to go in and make those kind of tweaks and changes here and there just to improve the overall look, especially like if you're building an area that has a bunch of palm trees, like maybe have palm trees next to the road or on a pedestrian path or something like that, so that it all blends together and again looks a little bit more unique and interesting. Sort of just goes back to my point of like, you don't want anything to look out of place, so try to find ways of blending things in, right? It's all a balancing act, and I think it takes a while to learn about the simple ways of making that happen. Like I mentioned earlier too, about cleaning up some lines and stuff, adding like hedges and things around some of the funky lines you have when you're doing pathing is a huge help. It's going to make your like pedestrian paths look so much cleaner with just a few trees and some shrubs. Like consider doing that as you're detailing, especially like in city areas. It's just a very nice way of making things look detailed, cleaning up any sort of odd mistakes, or sort of where that magnetic edge is with pathing. It just makes it look so much more polished. Cannot recommend that enough, just to make your builds start to step up to like a whole new level. A couple of final things I did is I started adding benches and bins along the seawall, and then I wanted to clean up some of these edges and some of these height changes with some grass and some rock, just to make it look a little bit more established as it's transitioning into an area that is at a different height. I wanted it to look like, okay, it wasn't just completely ignored, I guess. Now keep in mind too, when you have like a big areas of concrete, sometimes it's nice to throw benches, maybe a small like sitting area or something like that into those spaces. You can also use different planters with different bushes or trees to break up some of the monotony of concrete, because it can be a lot after a while. And you guys know how much concrete I added into the build already with the brushes and stuff to fill in certain spaces. So I do also want to go back and add some things to create some diversity in those areas, so it's not strictly just concrete everywhere. Now, finally, one of the big things I noticed I was missing, which you gotta have, right, is some boats for the marina. So I downloaded just a couple of assets. I didn't want to overwhelm. Again, you could do a lot of things here, including you could probably set routes, I believe, for these boats to actually run on. I wanted to keep it simple again because this is a pass around build, and I just wanted to place some static ships here just so it didn't look completely empty. And I put a couple in the Bay Area just to make it look like they were in progress of traveling. I know that might be disappointing some. I'm sure some people want them to be mobile, but for now I think this works. Now this is a very different type of video for me. I don't usually do this much time lapse, so I hope it wasn't a turn off from watching the video, or it wasn't too distracting. I tried to cut out certain pieces to make it a little bit more flowing and of course comprehensive. I wanted you guys to see the whole build, at least to some degree, and it coming together, the whole process of working behind it, and give some of my thoughts as to why I did certain things and what comes to mind when I'm building. Overall, I think the build came together really well. If I had to go back and change a few things, I mean, I may have played with terracing a little bit differently or added some density here and there, but I think this actually turned into a cool little spot. Sometimes picking these awkward spots on the map where there's crazy elevation changes or just unique characteristics is a really cool and interesting project to set up, because you're working towards something that you want to look a certain way, but it's a complete renovation of the area, right? It's very, very different from where it started. And given how the height worked and some of the curvatures and things like that, I didn't want to get too far away from the sort of natural setting that it was in. But it was really, really neat to see it come together and really change the whole area, in my eyes, of what it looked like and what it could be. With that said, thank you guys so much for watching the video. Remember to hit the subscribe button, leave a like, comment down below with your thoughts. The next person up is Conflict Nerd for the next part of the global collaboration, and I hope to see you guys around. Come back and visit. Take care.